Black power. Black power. Yeah, you know them bad Negroes. There was a member of the Atlanta Project of SNCC that got fired with guns by Kwame Ture and Jamil Alamid when they weren't quite ready for the revolution, you know what I mean? So I say black power real strong and earnestly. I was, the other night, Monday night, went to one of the local universities to hear Nadine Strawson, the chair of the ACLU's board, you know. And I was ambivalent about going because, you know, it was like, first of all, I didn't have time. But secondly, it was like, well, what is she going to talk about? And whether or not there's going to be some people there that I wanted to see but otherwise wouldn't get to see. So I said, well, I'll just go. So I slipped in the back late, right? And she was already up and talking. So I sat there and I listened, and frankly, I couldn't, I thought, well, maybe I'm really not hearing or understanding what she is saying. Maybe it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek, a kind of, she's going to get to the facts at some point. This is against the backdrop of having spent the past 12 months working on the United Nations Universe of the United States, which you process to assess countries, each UN member country's compliance with its UN obligations, the basic UN documents and those documents to which it's signed on to. And talk about Alice in Wonderland, I mean, it was just unbelievable, the lies that were trotted out and without, as Cuba put it, shamelessly. Even though everybody in the room, including the bootlicking Africans and Arabs, knew they were lying, they acquiesced to it with almost no exception, except, of course, the usual suspects. Nadine Strawson, at the end, said, at the end of her run, said she didn't understand why more people didn't concern themselves with the struggle of civil liberties. So I, of course, couldn't wait until the Q&A began so I could tell her. And that is, of course, because she, like all the rest, tell this mythological history of the United States as if it is fact, and then call it aspirational. And therefore, they have no obligation to fulfill this aspiration in this generation. There's a benefit to being at the end because so much of what I was going to say has already been said. But, of course, I wouldn't let an opportunity to give a speech go by without giving it. We know that from the colonial history, the war, I wanted to point out, has been waged by and in the interest of corporations. We've gone full circle at this point. You know, we talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That was a company. We talk about the Jamestown Colony. That was a charter, a proprietary company. It was in the service of those corporations that the land was stolen, that the African was kidnapped and enslaved. I think that it's critically important that we recall the fact that that is the case in which we're operating, and that while we affirm ourselves today, inform ourselves, that we also challenge the mythological vanity history of this ongoing criminal military global hub which passes itself off as a country, built with stolen labor on stolen land. The world's largest, in fact, wealthiest military installation, exerting control by applying force of varying degrees from the beat cop to the Border Patrol to the National Guard and reserves and the military itself. We must never make the mistake that any of those formations, any elements of that global gang, is anything less than a military formation designed and committed to, as the U.S. Constitution sets out in all of its commercial, not human rights glory, the protection and the promotion of the commercial interest of white male property owners. Now, when we say corporation, let's look at the genus of that word. It means corpus, it means the body, which was the king. And what we have is a substitution for the king by this cluster of folk who decided that they wanted, as the chairman puts it, wanted to sell your mama too, and seized the moment to do that. This has always been a military installation. It had to be a military installation, first, to prevent the Native American from reclaiming their land. Secondly, in order to ensure that the African did not join up with the Native American and reclaim the land and our freedom. So it has, from its inception, been a military installation. It's important also that we recognize the fact that prisoners have been resisting in this country from its inception. If you start with the enslavement of Africans and you recognize the prison system as a mechanism for the limitation of liberty, then we don't get confused about the reversal that we have at this point in time in terms of the numbers, although we remain repulsed, appalled, and outraged by it. Studies and reports submitted to the United Nations, and especially I give credit to Brother Ajamu Baraka, the executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, for pulling together more than 25 reports which were submitted to the United Nations, resulting in the unprecedented and historic issuance of 228 criticisms from around the world, friend and foe alike, of the United States. And those criticisms ranging from not just the high incarceration rates, the process of incarceration, the conditions of incarceration, as well as a panoply of lack of access to health care, homelessness, lack of access to meaningful education, and technology. You'll appreciate that, Glenn. To add to that, the use of the criminal punishment system against juveniles, ranging from the school to the jailhouse train, which ensures that they become fodder generation after generation, and the life without possibility of parole, which is imposed on youth, primarily youth of color, as young as 14 years old. The disproportionate number of Black and Latino men and increasing numbers of women in the criminal punishment system puts the United States out of compliance and in clear violation of international conventions on the elimination of racial discrimination. CERD is what it's called. And the International Convention on Cultural and Political Rights, given the indicia for racial profiling, used in racial profiling. The urgent nature of this problem is found in both national and state data. The United States has the largest incarceration rate in the world, as we all know. As of December 21st, 2008, there were 754 inmates per 100,000 U.S. residents. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, in 2008, over 7.3 million people, or 1 in every 31 in the United States, were on probation, in jail or prison, or on parole. 1 of 31, that's the general population. While 1 in 30 men between the ages of 20 and 34 is behind bars, for Black males in that age group, the figure is 1 in 9. The devastating impact of incarceration on families and communities is profound, affecting future income, opportunities for employment, civic engagement, and well-being into the future. According to the Sentencing Project, the incarceration rates of women of color, in particular mothers, is staggering. The number of incarcerated mothers has more than doubled, 122% from 29,500 in 1991 to 65,600 in 2007, with evident racial disparities impacting their children. 1 in 15 Black children and 1 in 42 Latino children has a parent in prison, compared to 1 in 111 white children. Estimates indicate that Black women represent 30% of all females incarcerated under state or federal jurisdiction. Hispanic women represent 16%. Black women are 3 times as likely as white women to be incarcerated, and Hispanic women are 69% more likely than white women. In its last report to the committee, meaning the Human Rights Council, the working group of the Universal Periodic Review, the United States noted that reasons for such racial disparities in the criminal justice system are complex and do not necessarily indicate differential treatment of persons in the criminal justice system. Now, Alice in Wonderland, I ask you, although only 1% of U.S. youth population in 2003, Native youth made up a full 2% of the cases referred to juvenile courts. This is the single greatest increase among any racial group in the U.S. Similarly, in 2003, Native American youth had a higher percentage of petition cases waived to adult criminal court, at 1.2% of all Native American cases formally processed. This was more than any other racial group in the United States. 26 out of every 100,000 African American youth are serving time. Let me say that again. 26 out of every 100,000 African American youth are serving time in adult prison, while for white youth, the rate is only 2.2 per 100,000. While the juvenile death penalty has been struck down in the United States, the juvenile life without possibility of parole condemns children to die in prison. Stark racial disparities in the imposition of JLWOP, as it's called, sentences are evident nationwide. Under age 17, African American youth are 19% of the population of juveniles who have been sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, under 17 years old. 19% of the population that has been sentenced, juveniles who've been sentenced to life without possibility of parole, under the age of 17 when they were sentenced, is African American. 65% of youth serving JLWOP sentences. 65%. We're what, 13% of the general population? The school-to-prison pipeline is a well-documented phenomenon that criminalizes youth of color within the educational system by using punitive disciplinary policies that lead to exclusion and increased juvenile arrest. The school-to-prison pipeline not only denies students the right to a quality education, it directly increases the rate of juveniles in criminal justice systems. In 2003, African American youth made up 16% of the nation's overall juvenile population, but accounted for 45% of juvenile arrests and while it's disturbing and right question becomes, and what are we going to do about it? There's a lot of publicity about this new Jim Crow. I want to disabuse anybody of any notions that there's anything new about Jim Crow in the United States of America. You see, that commercial document called the U.S. Constitution that's designed and does protect and promote the commercial interests of white male property owners did not abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment takes out of the hand of the private sector the enslavement of African people and puts it into the hands of the public sector by using its military might to decide what human behavior will be criminal behavior and thus placing a human being outside of civil society and subject to the exploitation of his or her labor, which is the reason we were brought here in the first place. Right. And you can look at the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and the reinforcement amendments. And they all have exceptions that ensure that African involvement in civil society is limited if it exists at all, and we are always subject to labor exploitation. Jim Crow is technically supposed to have run to the 60s, 50s or 60s. But when we look at the treatment that we continue to receive, is there a difference whether they call you a felon or they call you a nigger? Or a wetback for that matter. Or a chink. I call upon us, as I always do, to first of all recognize the fact that slave and African are not synonymous, nor should they be interchangeable, certainly not in our vocabulary. That further, that the model that Glenn gave us earlier about the mode of operation, the elements of the modus operandi of this military enterprise. War, chaos, democracy, and capitalism, and how those terms have come to be used interchangeably, creating chaos because people don't understand that they're not the same thing. And that same formula is the formula that is imposed on our communities. Gentrification creates chaos. Incarceration creates chaos. And of course, when the war wagons roll out of the local jails and law enforcement centers, that is definitely war. Democracy has just become another word for chaos because it means creating as many factions as possible in the name of political parties that can be bought off and manipulated and played one against the other to create an opening for U.S. intervention and control. There are people who have fought this, who come out of our generation. Some of you all are a little bit younger than some of the others of us. We refer to them loosely as political prisoners, but what they are human rights defenders. They are political activists, just like we see being touted and applauded across the Middle East. Today, 40 years after the fact, they are still sitting in prisons, in dungeons, in supermax isolation chambers across this country. Again, we are indebted to the people of Cuba. The Cuban government was the only country that specifically and consistently in its criticism demanded that the United States government release all political prisoners, not just the 7 we know about, Mumia, Leonard, and the Cuban 5, but all of them. Free them all, is what the Cuban government said. And not only did it say it in November, it came back on March the 18th and said it again. Iran joined them on that occasion. I got call time and I'm trying to be disciplined, but I want to call you to action. We meaning the working group of the U.S. Human Rights Network for Political Prisoners and Against State Repression, have launched a Free Our Mandelas Now, without getting into our criticisms of the brother. We think that it's useful to speak in language that our people can deal with. On November 5th, 2010, the U.S. Human Rights Report to the United Nations called attention to having an African-American president. The Attorney General and Secretaries of State have also, at points, been African-Americans. Today, on March 18th, the U.S. Representative Harold Koh played his Korean-American ancestry card. I tell you, it was painful, it was embarrassing, and it was infuriating too. They could trot out any one they wanted to, from Native Americans to white women and everything in between. At no time did the U.S. acknowledge the still imprisoned COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists, human rights defenders who paved the way for them. These longtime imprisoned democracy protesters are criminalized and imprisoned for over 30 years, like the U.S.'s George Washington, South Africa's Nelson Mandela, Brazil's Dilma Rousseff, and today's Arab awakening are all considered criminals by the governments they challenged. Now is the time for the United States, like South Africa and other celebrated countries, to make a peace with its past. So today, we ask you to join with us in calling on, and I use the term loosely, President Barack Obama, to take immediate steps to use his presidential clemency powers and commute the sentences to time served and immediate release of all imprisoned COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists currently held in federal custody. That he direct the Obama-Holder Department of Justice to review the convictions of all COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists in federal or state custody to identify and address the civil and human rights violations made against them, and that he use the Obama administration's executive authority to create a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission for release and compensation of all COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists currently held in federal and state facilities. We ask that you consider this and that you, as a resolution to be addressed by this body. In leaving, I would remind you of the demonstration calling for complete pardons for the Scott sisters, which will be held on Saturday, April the 1st in Jackson, Mississippi. Uhuru.